Human beings have been interacting with the environment since time immemorial. Human interaction with the environment has been growing exponentially all along, and this has led to over-exploitation of the ecology in a number of ways, resulting in environmental degradation. Overwhelming environmental degradation is the prime cause for various natural calamities such as landslides, earthquakes, floods, tsunamis, cyclones, avalanches, etc. Simultaneously, rapid industrialization and globalization in the past few years has led to repurposing of land use. Major economic transformation has been possible to a large extent due to changing use of land for various other purposes. On the other hand, attempts at environmental conservation by creating national reserves and parks has also led to changed land use practices. Now, all such activities have been responsible for forcing communities to move out of their traditional homes and localities to new areas where they are again compelled to start life afresh. And this has created a major problem of resettlement and rehabilitation of people around the globe.
Resettlement of people is needed due to two major reasons: natural reasons, man-made reasons. Natural reasons for needing resettlement of populations are various kinds of natural calamities like landslides, floods, earthquakes, tsunami, avalanche, etc. These are usually a result of overexploitation of natural resources, leading to an erosion and destruction of the ecology. As a result of natural calamities, homes and lifestyles of the affected populace are destroyed, and the people are forced to move to new areas to start life afresh. Today's economic growth has been possible only by repurposing the use of land. Growing industrialization has led to an increase in the number of factories, etc., being set up. Globalization has led to the setting up of special economic zones or SEZs in most countries, especially in the third world, for the setting up of industries of various kinds, with all the modern amenities and infrastructure being provided to the industries concerned. This needs a lot of land to be set aside for the development of such areas with the necessary infrastructure, that is, roads, transportation, ports, warehouses, electricity, water, etc. As a result, cities are expanding, with the villages being moved into forest areas and forest cover being reduced. The original inhabitants of the area, therefore, need to be resettled in new areas. The infrastructure needs of urban and industrial areas has increased manifold during the last few decades. This has led to an increase in the exploitation of the various resources of energy, renewable and non-renewable. A number of dams, power plants, etc. have come up to fulfill these needs. The construction of dams requires evacuation of all the villages that come in the area which will be flooded by the dam waters. As a result, massive resettlement needs to be undertaken throughout the course of the river wherever dams are being built on it. Industrialization also needs plenty of raw materials. Mining has been the source for a lot of the raw materials that are needed by industries. The issuing of mining permits in areas rich in resources means that the local populace has to be evacuated to ensure that the mining activities can be performed unhindered. Another man-made cause responsible for large-scale resettlement is the declaration of various areas as natural reserves in an attempt to conserve existing wildlife. The history of human civilization has always been set in areas where natural resources abound. This has usually meant riverbanks and forests. Early settlers lived in harmony with the flora and fauna around, knowing that conserving them was essential for their survival. With industrialization came greed for individual development, resulting in overexploitation of species and at times its extermination. The dramatic imbalance today has made governments realize that they need to conserve the ecology of their various forests. In this attempt, forests have been declared as natural reserves and the indigenous people residing in them have been moved out of their traditional homes. Man-made disasters like the Bhopal gas tragedy, derailment of trains, etc., also create situations demanding resettlement of large populations.
Resettlement is not just about moving people from one home and environment to another. It also entails ensuring that they are able to fulfill their family's needs and provide for them, particularly in the areas of food, clothing and shelter. It thus falls on the authorities concerned to make sure that adequate arrangements for this has been made in the new area where the community is shifted.
Various problems are faced during the process of resettlement and rehabilitation, mostly by the people who are being resettled. A lot of land has been acquired for building dams. This means that thousands of acres of fertile, arable land, which was used for cultivation, have now been submerged and are not available for cultivation. Alternative land provided is usually on barren land, which needs decades of tilling for it to become profitably productive. Similar is the case with land acquired for industries. Where the construction of various dams is concerned, large tracts of forest areas have been flooded and have now disappeared. The entire flora and fauna and the associated ecologies of these regions have been destroyed. The displacement of indigenous communities from their ancestral lands has led to a destruction of their traditional lifestyles, cultures, customs and traditions. As a result, indigenous populations are rapidly diminishing and heading towards extinction. It has been found that the resettlement area is usually such that the quality of land given in compensation is much lower than the original land that the displaced people possessed. As a result, it becomes very difficult for the oustees to grow crops on this land to feed their families. In India, most acquisition of land so far has been for building big dams. The people living along the rivers are used to free availability of water. Though the authorities are supposed to keep in mind the water requirements of the communities that are to be moved, especially drinking water facilities, more often than not, this has not been done. In India, even today, most professions are inherited, especially in the rural areas and the poorer segments of society. When a population moves to a new area, they are forced to take up new professions which they are not trained for or skilled in. As a result, they are unable to feed their families, leading to deepening poverty. Multiple displacements. People are moved from one area to another due to a new developmental project. A few years later, another new project is envisaged in the area where they are now settled. The result is that they have to move yet again. This has repeated effects on their lifestyles and livelihoods, leading to a further deepening of poverty.
It has often been found that the project affected do not end up being the project beneficiaries. The fruits of developmental projects are directly enjoyed by the affluent residing in urban areas rather than those who have sacrificed their homes for the so-called development of the country. The result is that the displaced find themselves doubly exploited. Loss of homes, cultures and traditional livelihoods on the one hand and continued deepening poverty on the other, since they are not trained for the jobs that are now available.
The World Bank, Asian Development Bank, International Finance Corporation, United Nations Development Programme, as well as most multilateral and private agencies, including commercial banks, require some kind of prior social impact assessment and some form of resettlement and rehabilitation provisions for all the projects that they finance. The World Bank was the first lending agency to adopt a policy on resettlement and rehabilitation through its operative policy 4.30 called Involuntary Resettlement in June 1990. Its operative policy 4.01 Environmental Assessment of October 1991 is also applicable to all projects. These two, in conjunction, have now forced governments around the world to bring environmental assessment and resettlement into the development process. The Land Acquisition Act 1894 is the only legal instrument available in India to address the issue of development-induced displacement. Compensation and rehabilitation benefit for the project affected or displaced people in the project is determined on the basis of ownership of land as per the said Act. A serious weakness of the Act is that it only offers cash compensation for the land being acquired in the project. The resettlement and rehabilitation of affected or displaced people does not fall within the scope of the Act. The Act recognizes only individual rights, not collective or community rights and hereditary usage rights. Again, the Act recognizes only the legal records of rights. Thus, those who are living upon government land for generations but do not have any records of rights, or are traditionally dependent on the common property resources, or have survived by rendering services to the village community as a whole, are not entitled to get any compensation according to the present legislation. The Coal Mining Bearing Act 1957 was established in the economic interest of the government to gain greater public control over the coal mining industry and its development by providing for the acquisition by the government on unworked land containing or likely to contain coal deposits or of rights in or over such land. However, though this Act speaks of financial compensation for the owners of such land, it does not mention anything about any compensation or resettlement and rehabilitation of those whose livelihoods will be affected by such an acquisition. Till date, there is no national legislation or policy in India for comprehensive resettlement and rehabilitation for development-induced displacement across the country. However, the National Thermal Power Corporation (NTPC) and Coal India Limited (CIL) both public sector undertakings of the central government have their own resettlement and rehabilitation policies prepared in 1993 and 1994 respectively for the rehabilitation of displaced people for the execution of their projects.
In the absence of a central law or even a central policy that governs resettlement and rehabilitation or lays down guidelines, resettlement and rehabilitation of displaced people has been based on ad hoc plans, resolutions and orders that have been adopted for specific states or even projects as and when the need arises. Thus, resettlement and rehabilitation has been ad hoc and piecemeal. Now, as a result, different state governments have formulated different policies for resettlement and rehabilitation.
In most states, there is no uniform policy on resettlement and rehabilitation, even for different kinds of development projects. Maharashtra and Karnataka have legislations on resettlement and rehabilitation for displaced people for all kinds of projects. Madhya Pradesh has legislation on resettlement and rehabilitation for the displaced people for irrigation projects only. The law may be applicable to other projects at the discretion of the government. Orissa has a resettlement and rehabilitation policy for the water resources development projects. Gujarat has passed several government orders for resettlement and rehabilitation of displaced people of Sardar Sarovar project, but the state is yet to come out with a comprehensive resettlement and rehabilitation policy for displaced people of other development projects. Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu and Rajasthan have passed several government orders for resettlement and rehabilitation of people displaced by development projects, most of them funded by the World Bank. Other states have government orders or policy forms for resettlement and rehabilitation of displaced people due to different kinds of development projects. There is no law which speaks of the need for resettlement and rehabilitation of victims of natural calamities like floods, earthquakes, cyclones, famines, etc. The draft Land Acquisition, Resettlement and Rehabilitation Bill was placed before the Indian Parliament for discussion by the Ministry of Rural Development, Government of India on July 27, 2011. Various versions of this bill have been seen in the Parliament over the years. This bill is an attempt to scrap the old Land Acquisition Act 1894 altogether. It proposes to combine land acquisition and resettlement and rehabilitation together so that resettlement and rehabilitation becomes an essential part of the land acquisition process. This will ensure that the interests of project-affected families are not neglected. It also seems to reflect the international requirements by lending agencies like the World Bank in this regard. The draft makes it mandatory for a social impact assessment report to be prepared before the project begins. It proposes a comprehensive compensation plan for those affected, including those whose lands are to be acquired and others who live and work in the area. It envisages the setting up of a national monitoring committee for resettlement and rehabilitation to monitor the speedy implementation of resettlement and rehabilitation. It also proposes the establishment of Land Acquisition, Rehabilitation and Resettlement Dispute Settlement Authority at the centre and the states to deal with any disputes that may arise under the proposed Act. The draft bill makes it mandatory to give employment to at least one member of each project-affected family. However, the draft bill does not specifically mention that the rehabilitation and resettlement provisions listed here are in any way applicable to those who are displaced by natural calamities.
Considering that the country is on the path of economic development and the requirements of the World Bank and all major international lending agencies include a mandatory environmental assessment and resettlement and rehabilitation policies in the execution of any major project, there is a ray of hope that soon they will take center stage in any major project. This will go a long way to protect the poor from being exploited in the name of developmental work.